Stop. Before you say something you don't deserve to carry. The word cut through the air like a quiet command no one dared to ignore. But moments before that voice ever existed in the room, Naomi Carter stood beneath the golden chandeliers of the Vance Grand Hall, her hands trembling just enough to betray what her face tried desperately to hide. The polished marble floor beneath her worn black shoes reflected a world she didn't belong to. Crystal glasses, silk dresses, tailored suits worth more than she made in a year, yet somehow she was the one everyone was staring at as if she had broken something far more valuable than glass. Say it, the woman in the emerald gown insisted, her voice smooth but sharp, the kind that didn't need to be loud to humiliate. Apologize properly this time. Naomi swallowed, her throat dry, her fingers tightening around the edge of the serving tray she still held like a shield, though it protected her from nothing. She had replayed the last 30 seconds in her mind again and again, the sudden movement, the splash of red wine, the gasp that followed, but she knew what she saw, and more importantly, what she didn't do. Still, the room had already decided. A quiet ripple of whispers moved through the guests, some amused, some indifferent, a few already raising their phones just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to capture a moment they thought would be entertaining later. Naomi kept her eyes lowered, just like she'd learned to do, just like she had done every day since she started working here 2 weeks ago, because invisibility meant safety, and safety meant she could keep sending money back home, could keep her mother's medication paid for, could keep everything from falling apart. "I'm waiting," the woman said again, tilting her head slightly, her diamonds catching the light as if even they were watching. The manager stood nearby, arms crossed, offering Naomi nothing but a tight warning, look the kind that said, "Don't argue, don't think, just fix it." Naomi's heartbeat echoed in her ears, loud enough to drown out the soft piano music drifting from the corner of the room, loud enough to make her feel like everyone could hear it. She knew how this worked. It didn't matter what was true. It mattered what was easier. And right now, what was easier was her saying 2 simple words. "I'm sorry." Her voice barely rose above a whisper, fragile, uncertain, as if even the words themselves resisted being spoken. Louder, the woman replied instantly, a faint smile forming, not kind, not forgiving, just satisfied. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, just enough to breathe, just enough to try again, though her eyes still refused to meet anyone else's. "I'm sorry," she said, clearer this time, but something in her chest tightened, something that felt heavier than embarrassment, heavier than fear. It felt like something being taken from her, piece by piece, around her. A few guests exchanged glances, some nodding as if justice had been served, others already losing interest now that the scene was nearing its end. But just as Naomi's lips parted again, just as she prepared to repeat the apology the way they wanted, polished, submissive, complete, the room shifted in a way no one could immediately explain. It wasn't a sound. Not at first. It was a pause, a subtle hesitation in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks, though nothing visible had changed. Then came the voice, calm, controlled, unmistakably firm. "Stop." It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The single word moved through the room, silencing the low murmurs, freezing hands mid-motion, drawing every eye toward its source without effort. Naomi felt it before she saw him, that shift in attention, that invisible weight pressing against the moment, and slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted her gaze. At the far end of the room, a man stood from his seat, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if time itself adjusted to match his pace. His suit was simple but precise, dark fabric cut perfectly to his frame, his presence commanding not through noise, but through certainty. Alexander Vance. Though most in the room recognized him only as another high-profile guest, there was something in the way the staff subtly straightened, in the way the manager's expression flickered just for a second, that hinted at something deeper, something not spoken aloud. Naomi didn't know his name yet, but she felt the shift all the same. His eyes moved past the crowd, past the glittering distractions, and settled not on her but on the woman in the emerald gown. And then, with a calm that carried more weight than anger ever could, he asked, "What exactly is she apologizing for?" The question did not echo loudly, but it lingered in the air with a weight that pressed against every chest in the room, and for a moment no one answered, not because they did not hear it, but because they suddenly were not sure what the answer was supposed to be. The woman in the emerald gown blinked. Just once, her confident smile faltering at the edges as if it had been drawn too tightly and was now beginning to crack, and she let out a soft, almost incredulous laugh that did not quite reach her eyes. "She spilled wine on me," she said, gesturing lightly to the faint stain along the side of her dress, her tone still polished, still controlled, but now carrying a subtle urgency beneath it. "I think that is obvious." Alexander Vance did not move any closer at first, but his gaze did not shift either, steady and precise, as though he were examining something far more intricate than a simple mistake. "Obvious," he repeated quietly, the word neither agreeing nor challenging, just placing it back into the space between them where it seemed to lose some of its certainty. Naomi stood frozen, her fingers still curled around the tray, her apology caught halfway between spoken and withdrawn, unsure whether she should step back, speak again, or disappear entirely the way she usually did when attention became too heavy to carry. The manager cleared his throat, stepping forward with a practiced smile that had resolved countless situations before. "Sir, it was just an unfortunate accident, and the staff member has already apologized, so there is really no need to—" "I did not ask what happened after," Alexander interrupted, not raising his voice, but somehow making the interruption feel final. "I asked what she is apologizing for." The difference hung there, sharp and undeniable. A few guests shifted in place, the soft clink of a glass being set down echoing louder than it should have in the quiet that followed. The woman's expression tightened, her posture straightening as if reclaiming control of the narrative required nothing more than standing a little taller. "Are you suggesting that I am mistaken?" she asked, her tone cool now, less amused, more defensive. Alexander took a single step forward, the polished floor barely making a sound beneath him, yet every movement seemed to draw the room tighter around the moment. "I am suggesting," he said, his voice even, measured, "that before someone is asked to lower themselves in front of a room full of strangers, we should be certain they have something to lower themselves for." Naomi felt something shift inside her at those words, something small but undeniable, like a door opening just enough to let light through, though she did not dare move yet, did not dare believe that the moment might turn in a direction she had not prepared for. The manager's smile faltered completely now, replaced by a flicker of unease as he glanced between the guest and the man who had spoken, as if trying to calculate which side of the situation carried more weight. "We have already addressed the issue," he insisted, though his voice lacked the confidence it held moments ago. "There is no need to escalate this further." Alexander's gaze finally shifted, just slightly, toward the manager, and for the first time, there was something colder beneath the calm, not anger, but clarity. "Escalation happens when truth is ignored," he said, "not when it is asked for." The room seemed to draw in a collective breath, subtle but synchronized, as though everyone present understood that the situation had moved beyond a simple apology into something else entirely, something that required attention, whether they wanted to give it or not. The woman in the emerald gown let out a sharper breath, her patience thinning. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Everyone here saw what happened." "Did they?" Alexander asked, turning slightly now, his gaze sweeping across the nearby guests. Not accusing, not confrontational, but expectant, as though he were inviting them to examine their own certainty. A few eyes dropped immediately, others hesitated, and one man near the edge of the group adjusted his cufflinks with unnecessary focus, suddenly finding them more interesting than the scene unfolding before him. Naomi's heart pounded harder now, not from fear alone, but from something unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to hope, though she kept her posture still, her expression careful, as if any movement might break whatever fragile shift was taking place. Alexander turned back to the woman, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "Tell me," he said, "where were you standing when the wine spilled?" The question landed differently this time. Not a challenge, not a statement, but a request that required more than a rehearsed answer. And for the first time since the moment began, the woman hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for everyone to notice. And in that hesitation, the certainty that had filled the room only moments ago began to unravel, thread by thread, until all that remained was silence, waiting to see what would come next. The hesitation did not last long, but it was enough to fracture the illusion that had held the room together. And once that crack appeared, it began to spread in ways no one could quite control. The woman in the emerald gown drew in a measured breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric near the stain, as if reminding herself of the evidence she believed was on her side. "I was standing exactly where I am now," she replied, her voice regaining some of its sharpness, though the certainty felt rehearsed now rather than natural. "She came from my left, careless, distracted, and the tray tilted." Naomi felt her chest tighten at those words, not because they were new, but because they were familiar, the kind of accusation that sounded believable simply because it was spoken with confidence. And for a brief moment, she wondered if this would end the same way it always did, with truth bending quietly beneath convenience. But Alexander did not nod, did not accept the explanation as something complete. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as though adjusting the angle of a picture that did not quite align. "From your left," he repeated, his tone thoughtful rather than confrontational. "And yet the stain falls along the right side of your dress." The observation was simple, almost casual, but it landed with precision, and a subtle murmur moved through the nearby guests as a few eyes shifted downward, tracing the line of deep red against emerald silk for the first time with genuine attention. The woman's lips parted slightly, as if preparing to respond immediately, but no words came at first, and that silence stretched just long enough to draw more attention than any argument could have. "Fabric moves," she said finally, her voice tightening. "That does not prove anything." "No," Alexander agreed, his expression unchanged. "It does not prove anything on its own." He took another step forward, closing just enough distance to make the conversation feel more intimate, more focused, as though the rest of the room had faded into the background. But details rarely stand alone. Naomi's grip on the tray loosened slightly, her fingers aching from how tightly she had held it, though she did not dare lower it yet, did not dare assume she was no longer required to stand in place as part of a scene she never chose to enter. The manager shifted again, clearly uncomfortable now, his earlier authority replaced by a cautious restraint. "Sir," he said carefully, With all due respect, this is a private event, and our priority is to maintain a pleasant atmosphere for our guests. Alexander's gaze flickered toward him briefly, not dismissive, but unwavering. Then perhaps we should ensure that the atmosphere is built on something stable, he replied, not assumptions. The word assumptions lingered, heavier than expected, as if it carried more meaning than its simplicity suggested. A man near the back of the group cleared his throat softly, then spoke up, his voice hesitant but audible. I was standing over there, he said, gesturing toward a table a few feet away, and I thought I saw the glass move before she even got close. The room shifted again, more noticeably this time, as attention spread beyond the two central figures and began to pull in others who had previously chosen silence. The woman's expression hardened, her composure now held together by effort rather than ease. "Are you suggesting I knocked my own drink over?" she asked, the question sharp, almost incredulous. "I am suggesting," Alexander said, his tone steady. "That memory can be influenced by expectation, especially when people decide what they believe before they look closely." Naomi felt the weight in her chest shift again, no longer pressing down as heavily, though uncertainty still held her in place, her mind struggling to catch up with a reality that felt unfamiliar. For the first time since the moment began, she allowed her eyes to lift slightly, not fully, but enough to see the faces around her more clearly, and what she saw was no longer certainty, but doubt, small and growing, reflected in glances that no longer aligned with one another. The manager exhaled quietly, then forced a polite smile once more, though it lacked conviction. "Perhaps we can review the security footage," he said, the suggestion offered as a compromise, though it carried the weight of necessity. Alexander inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a step in the right direction. "That would be a good place to start," he said. The woman's shoulders stiffened, her posture still elegant, still composed, but no longer effortless. "This is unnecessary," she insisted, though her voice had softened just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "If it confirms what you believe," Alexander replied, "then it will be quick." The simplicity of the statement left little room for resistance, and for a moment no one spoke. No one moved, as though the entire room had paused on the edge of something inevitable. Naomi stood there, her breathing shallow but steadying, the tray still in her hands, but no longer a shield, more like a reminder of where she had started and where she now stood, caught between what had been decided for her and what might finally be seen for what it truly was. And in that fragile space, something within her straightened, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the difference. No one argued after that, not openly, because the moment had already shifted beyond opinion into something that demanded proof, and in a room built on appearances, proof carried a different kind of weight. The manager nodded quickly, signaling to a staff member near the entrance, his movements precise but slightly rushed now, as if efficiency could restore control that had quietly slipped away. "Bring up the footage from the main floor," he instructed, his voice carefully neutral, though the tension beneath it was impossible to miss. Naomi felt her pulse rise again, not from fear this time, but from the uncertainty of what truth would look like when it was finally revealed, because truth, she had learned, did not always protect the people who needed it most. The staff member disappeared through a side door, and for a few seconds that felt longer than they should. The room settled into a silence that was not empty, but waiting. Glasses remained half raised. Conversations suspended mid-thought, eyes fixed on a story that no longer belonged to whispers. The woman in the emerald gown stood perfectly still, her posture flawless. Her chin lifted just enough to suggest confidence, but her fingers no longer rested easily at her side. They moved subtly, brushing against the fabric again, as if trying to smooth something that could not be smoothed. Alexander remained where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, his presence steady, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and expected the truth to arrive on its own terms. Naomi lowered the tray slowly, her arms finally giving in to the quiet ache that had built from holding it too long, though she kept it close to her body, uncertain whether she was allowed to let go of it entirely. She did not step away. Not yet. A soft hum broke through the silence as a large screen near the far wall flickered to life, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light before settling into a clear image of the ballroom from a high corner angle. The shift in attention was immediate. Conversations that had been held in breath now leaned forward into focus. The footage began to play, smooth and uninterrupted, capturing the same elegant movement, the same refined choreography of servers and guests that had filled the room moments earlier. Naomi saw herself enter the frame, smaller than she had imagined, moving carefully between tables, her steps measured, her attention fixed on the tray she carried. It was strange, watching herself from the outside, as if she were someone else entirely, someone easier to judge, easier to misunderstand. The woman in the emerald gown appeared moments later, stepping into view with practiced grace. Her glass raised, her attention turned toward a conversation just beyond the edge of the frame. For a second, everything looked exactly as it had been described, and Naomi felt that familiar tightness return to her chest, that quiet fear that even the truth could be shaped into something else if it was not seen clearly enough. Then the angle shifted slightly as the footage continued, and something small, almost invisible at first, began to stand out. The woman's hand moved, not dramatically, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough. The glass tilted before Naomi ever reached her. A subtle motion, a careless turn of the wrist, red liquid slipping over the edge of crystal, falling in a thin arc that landed exactly where it now stained the fabric. Naomi had not touched her, not even close. The room did not react all at once. It happened in layers. First, a single breath caught somewhere near the front, then another. Then the quiet shift of weight as someone adjusted their stance, no longer certain of what they had believed. The footage continued for a few more seconds, showing Naomi stepping forward just after the spill, her body reacting to a situation already unfolding, not causing it. And then it stopped. The screen went still. No commentary, no interpretation, just the image. Paused at the moment that said everything without raising its voice. Naomi did not move. She could feel the change before she saw it, the way the air itself seemed to settle differently around her, no longer pressing down, but opening, creating space where there had been none. The woman in the emerald gown stared at the screen, her expression no longer composed, no longer carefully constructed, but searching, as if there might be another version of events hidden somewhere she had missed. "That angle does not show everything," she said finally, though the words lacked the firmness they once held. "It could be misleading." Alexander did not look at the screen again. He looked at her. "It shows enough," he replied, his voice calm, but final in a way that did not invite debate. The manager's posture shifted immediately, the tension in his shoulders replaced by something closer to urgency, but of a different kind now, one that moved in the opposite direction. He turned toward Naomi, his expression changing quickly, too quickly, as if trying to correct itself in real time. "It appears there has been a misunderstanding," he said, the words carefully chosen, though they felt smaller than the moment required. Naomi met his gaze for the first time, not fully, but enough. her eyes steady in a way they had not been before, because something had changed, not just in the room, but in her. She had not spoken. She had not argued. And yet, the truth had found its way forward anyway. And in that quiet realization, she stood a little straighter, not as someone who had been forgiven, but as someone who had never needed to ask for it in the first place. Silence did not fall all at once. It settled slowly, like dust after something unseen had been disturbed. And in that silence, every shift in posture, every glance, every breath carried meaning that could no longer be ignored. The screen remained frozen for a moment longer before fading to black. But the image it had shown lingered far more vividly in the minds of those watching than anything still visible in the room. The woman in the emerald gown straightened her shoulders, as if posture alone could restore what had just been undone. But her eyes no longer held the same certainty, and the space around her felt different now, not as supportive, not as aligned. The manager stepped forward again, though this time his movement lacked the confidence of authority and carried instead the careful weight of correction. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone noticeably softer, almost rehearsed in its attempt at professionalism. It seems there was an error in judgment. The words hung there. Insufficient, too small for what had just occurred, and Naomi felt them pass over her without landing, because something inside her had already moved beyond needing them. She did not respond immediately. She did not lower her gaze. For the first time since she had entered this room, she stood still, without shrinking. Alexander watched quietly, his presence unchanged. But there was something different now in the way the room oriented itself around him, not just acknowledging him, but adjusting because of him. The woman in the emerald gown exhaled slowly, her lips pressing together before she spoke again, her voice controlled but no longer effortless. "This is unnecessary," she said, though the edge had dulled, replaced by something closer to insistence than certainty. It was a misunderstanding, nothing more. Alexander's eyes did not leave her. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, as if weighing the phrase. Then he took a step closer, not aggressively, but deliberately, closing the distance just enough to make the next words impossible to ignore. "You asked her to apologize for something she did not do," he said, his tone even calm, but carrying a finality that did not invite reinterpretation, in front of a room full of people who were ready to believe you without question. No one interrupted, no one moved. The truth had already done its work. The woman's gaze flickered, not to Naomi, but to the people around her, as if searching for support that no longer stood where it had before, and finding none. "I did not know," she said finally. The words quieter now, less performative, more human, though still guarded. "You did not look," Alexander replied, and there was no accusation in his voice, only clarity. The difference between those two things settled heavily in the air. Naomi felt her hands relax at her sides, the tray now resting against her hip. Forgotten. Unnecessary. And for a brief moment she became aware of the way her heart was beating. Steady now, no longer racing, no longer trying to escape the moment, but present within it. The manager shifted again, then spoke, this time with a tone that carried more urgency than before, though directed differently. "Miss Carter," he said, "on behalf of the staff, I would like to apologize for the situation." Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, her expression calm, her voice quiet but clear when she finally spoke. "You asked me to apologize?" she said, not confrontational, not raised, just stated, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could have. The manager's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His response caught somewhere between intention and realization. Alexander's gaze moved between them, observing not just the words, but the shift beneath them. Then, slowly, he turned back toward the woman in the emerald gown, and for the first time, there was a subtle change in the room's expectation, a quiet understanding of what would come next. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand. He simply waited. And that waiting, that silence, became its own kind of pressure. The woman stood there, her posture still elegant, her appearance still flawless, but something in her composure had softened, not broken, but adjusted, as if she had stepped out of a role she could no longer fully maintain. Her eyes moved, briefly, toward Naomi, then away, then back again. And in that hesitation, something shifted that could not be undone. "Miss Carter," she said at last, the words measured, careful. "I may have reacted too quickly." The room remained silent. It was not enough, and everyone knew it. Alexander did not move, but his presence remained steady, a quiet anchor in the moment. Naomi did not respond. She did not nod. She did not speak. She simply stood there, her shoulders straight, her gaze steady, no longer asking for acknowledgement, no longer accepting less than what was true, and in that stillness, something became clear to everyone watching, something that had nothing to do with wealth or status or appearance. Respect, real respect, did not come from being corrected. It came from being recognized. And for the first time that evening, the room began to understand exactly what that meant. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, not because no one knew what should happen next, but because now they all understood exactly what it required. And that understanding carried a weight far heavier than any accusation ever could. The woman in the emerald gown remained still, her breath measured, her expression composed but no longer untouchable, as though something inside her had shifted from certainty to awareness. And that awareness demanded more than carefully chosen words. Alexander did not speak. He did not need to. His presence filled the space with a quiet expectation that could not be ignored. And for the first time that evening, the power in the room did not belong to wealth or status or appearance, but to something far simpler and far more difficult to meet. Naomi stood across from her, not moving, not retreating, her shoulders steady, her gaze level, no longer searching for permission to exist within the moment, but holding her place within it. The woman's lips parted again, then closed, as if the next words required more than instinct, required intention, and that pause alone said more than anything she had spoken before. Around them, the guests watched without whispering now, without shifting, without distraction, because something had changed in the way they were seeing the scene unfold. This was no longer entertainment, no longer spectacle, but a moment that asked something of everyone present. Finally, she spoke. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "I was wrong. The words were simple, direct, and for a second they seemed to hang in the air, almost fragile in their honesty." Naomi did not react immediately. She heard them, felt them, but she did not rush to accept them, did not nod or soften, because for the first time she was not being asked to respond quickly to make someone else comfortable. The woman continued, her voice steadier now, though still measured. "I assumed, and I acted on that assumption without taking the time to understand what actually happened," she said, each word deliberate, as if chosen carefully, not for appearance, but for truth. "That was not fair to you." The room remained silent, but it was no longer a heavy silence. It was attentive, almost reflective, as though each person present was considering not just what had happened, but how easily it could have gone unnoticed, unquestioned, uncorrected. Alexander's gaze softened slightly, not in approval, But in acknowledgement that the moment had reached something real, he did not intervene. He did not add to it. He allowed it to stand on its own. Naomi finally exhaled, a breath she had not realized she had been holding, and in that small release, something inside her settled. She shifted her weight slightly, lowering the tray completely now, letting it rest against her side, no longer needing to hold on to it as a barrier between herself and the world around her. When she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, not raised, not trembling. "Thank you," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more dignity than any apology ever could. There was no bitterness in her tone, no accusation, no need to revisit what had already been revealed. She did not need to prove anything anymore. The truth had already done that for her. The manager stepped forward again, his posture different now, less rigid, more aware, as though he too had been forced to reconsider something he had once taken for granted. "Miss Carter," he said, "you will not be required to apologize for this incident, and we appreciate your professionalism under the circumstances." Naomi met his gaze briefly, then nodded once, not submissively, but in acknowledgement, accepting the correction without diminishing herself in the process. Alexander turned slightly, his attention shifting from the individuals involved to the room as a whole, and though he did not address them directly, the effect was immediate. People adjusted their posture, their expressions, their understanding of what they had just witnessed. Without raising his voice, without making a speech, he had changed the direction of the moment entirely. He glanced back at Naomi for a brief second, not lingering, not intrusive, but enough to recognize her presence, her strength, her quiet refusal to be reduced to something smaller than she was. Then he stepped back, returning to where he had been, as if the role he had played was complete, as if the outcome had never been about him in the first place. Naomi remained where she was for a moment longer, feeling the shift in the room, the way eyes no longer looked through her, but at her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something closer to respect. And in that moment, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider before. That dignity did not come from being defended. It came from standing still long enough for the truth to be seen. And when it finally was, it did not need to raise its voice. It only needed to exist. The room did not return to normal right away, not in the way it had been before, because something subtle but irreversible had shifted beneath the surface. And even as conversations slowly resumed and glasses were lifted again, there was a different kind of awareness in the air, one that lingered quietly in the way people glanced at Naomi, no longer overlooking her, no longer reducing her to a background presence that existed only to serve. Naomi took a small step back, not retreating, but repositioning herself, as though reclaiming space that had always been hers but never fully acknowledged. The tray in her hand felt lighter now, not because its weight had changed, but because she was no longer carrying something invisible along with it. She turned slightly, preparing to return to her duties, because work did not pause simply because something important had happened, and survival still required consistency, still required showing up, even after moments that felt like turning points. As she moved, a quiet voice reached her, calm and measured. "Miss Carter." She stopped, just briefly, then turned. Alexander stood a few steps away, his posture relaxed, his expression composed, but his attention direct, focused in a way that did not demand, but acknowledged, up close. There was nothing exaggerated about him, no unnecessary display of authority, just a presence that felt grounded, deliberate. Naomi met his gaze for a moment, then lowered it slightly, not out of fear, but out of habit, though the movement was smaller than it would have been before. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady, He studied her for a second, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that suggested he was seeing more than what was immediately visible. "You handled that well," he said simply. The words were not dramatic, not overly expressive, but they carried a sincerity that made them feel heavier than praise. Naomi paused, unsure how to respond at first. Because she was not used to being seen in that way, not used to being acknowledged for something that had not required performance, only endurance. "I was just doing my job," she replied quietly. Alexander's expression did not change, but something in his gaze softened slightly, as if he recognized the deeper truth beneath her words. "No," he said, "you were doing more than that." The distinction settled between them, not as a correction, but as a recognition that extended beyond the moment itself. Naomi felt that same unfamiliar shift again, that quiet sense of being understood without needing to explain, and it unsettled her in a way she could not immediately define, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was rare. Around them, the room continued to move, conversations picking up, music filling the spaces where silence had once held everything still. But the moment between them remained untouched by that movement, existing just outside of it. "How long have you been working here?" he asked after a brief pause, his tone conversational, but intentional. "2 weeks," Naomi answered, her fingers adjusting slightly on the tray, grounding herself in something familiar. And before that she hesitated for just a second, not because the answer was complicated, but because it was personal, and she was not used to sharing it. "A diner on 5th Street, she said, "and cleaning jobs on weekends." Alexander nodded once, absorbing the information without reaction, without judgment, as though it was simply part of a larger picture he was assembling. "You are not invisible," he said then, the words quiet, almost reflective, but unmistakably directed at her. Naomi blinked, the statement catching her off guard, because it touched something she had not said out loud, something she had lived with instead. She did not respond immediately, because she was not sure how to. Not sure what it meant to be told something she had spent so long trying not to expect. "Excuse me," she said softly, more out of instinct than confusion. Alexander did not elaborate further, not directly. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if the statement itself was enough, as if it did not need to be explained to be understood. "You should get back to your work," he added, his tone returning to something more neutral, more distant, but not dismissive. Naomi nodded once, this time with more certainty, and turned away, stepping back into the flow of the room, carrying the tray once more, but no longer feeling like she had to disappear behind it. As she moved between tables, something subtle had changed in the way people responded to her, in the way they made space, in the way their eyes followed her not with dismissal, but with awareness. And she felt it, not as a tension she needed to hold on to, but as something that simply existed now, unforced, unspoken. At the far end of the room, Alexander resumed his seat, blending back into the environment as if he had never disrupted it. But the truth remained, woven into the evening in a way that could not be undone. And Naomi, moving quietly through the same space she had entered earlier, carried something different with her now, not something visible, not something anyone could point to, but something steady, something rooted, not pride, not relief, something quieter, something stronger, the kind of dignity that does not ask to be noticed, but once seen cannot be ignored. The evening moved forward, but it did not forget, and neither did the people inside it, because once a moment like that unfolded in plain sight, it left a quiet imprint on everything that followed. Naomi continued her work, her steps measured, her movements precise, but no longer cautious in the same way. no longer shrinking into corners or avoiding eye contact, as if presence itself was something she had to apologize for. The tray in her hand carried glasses that caught the light, reflecting fragments of the room back at her in small, shifting pieces, and for the first time, she noticed them, not as distractions, but as details that existed alongside her, not above her. At a nearby table, a guest who had earlier turned away now met her eyes directly when she approached, offering a small nod as he accepted his drink, a simple gesture, almost insignificant, but different from what had come before. Naomi returned the nod, just slightly, her expression calm, her posture steady. And then she moved on, because there was still work to be done, and she understood now that dignity did not interrupt responsibility. It strengthened it. Across the room, the manager stood near the entrance, his attention sharper, his interactions more deliberate, as though he had been forced to re-evaluate not just a single decision, but the way he had been making them all along. When Naomi passed him, he stepped aside instinctively, creating space rather than directing it. And though he did not speak, the gesture itself carried an acknowledgement that did not need words. The woman in the emerald gown remained near her table, though she no longer commanded the same attention. Her presence quieter now, more contained, as if she had stepped back into herself after realizing how far her assumption had reached beyond its place. A few guests spoke to her, their voices polite, their expressions neutral, but the dynamic had shifted, not dramatically, not with confrontation, but with a subtle recalibration of respect that could not be undone. Naomi did not avoid her, but she did not seek her out either. When their paths crossed briefly near the edge of the room, there was a moment, small but clear, where both paused just enough to acknowledge one another, and the woman gave a slight nod, not performative, not for display, but quiet, contained, real. Naomi returned it, equally simple, and then continued on, because there was no need to hold on to the moment any longer than it required. At the far end of the hall, Alexander sat with a group of men, their conversation low, controlled, the kind that carried weight without needing volume, but his attention, though engaged, occasionally shifted not in distraction, but in awareness, as if he remained connected to the space beyond his immediate circle. He did not call Naomi over again. He did not single her out further. Whatever needed to be done had already been done. And he understood that dignity did not grow under constant attention. It grew in the absence of it, in the quiet continuation of ordinary moments that were no longer diminished. As the evening progressed, the music softened slightly. The lighting dimmed just enough to signal the approach of closing hours, and the energy of the room settled into something more relaxed, more reflective. Naomi moved through it all with the same steady rhythm, clearing tables, refilling glasses, responding when needed, but no longer disappearing between those actions. She was seen now, not because she demanded it, but because something had made it impossible to ignore her presence without acknowledging the truth that had been revealed. Near the end of the night, as the last few guests prepared to leave, Naomi stepped outside briefly to the service entrance, the cool air brushing against her skin, grounding her in a way the controlled environment inside could not. She stood there for a moment, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breath slow, even, as she looked out at the quiet street beyond the building, the distant hum of the city continuing as it always did, unchanged by what had happened inside. But she was not unchanged, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would alter everything overnight, but in a quieter, more permanent way, like a foundation that had been reinforced without anyone seeing the work being done. She thought of the moment when she had almost apologized again, when she had nearly accepted something that was not hers to carry, and she realized how easily that could have been the end of it, how easily the night could have continued without interruption, leaving her smaller, quieter, unseen, but it had not. And that difference stayed with her, not as something to hold on to, but as something to understand. After a few seconds, she turned back toward the door, re-entering the space she had walked through so many times before, but now with a presence that did not ask for permission. Inside, the lights still glowed, the floors still reflected, the work still waited, but something within her had shifted in a way that did not depend on any of it. And as she stepped forward, back into the rhythm of the evening, she carried that with her, not as a shield, not as a statement, but as something steady, something quiet, something that no one could take from her again. By the time the last guest stepped out into the night, the grand hall had grown quieter, the echo of polished shoes replaced by the softer rhythm of cleanup, glass against glass, fabric against marble, the kind of sounds that signaled an ending without needing to announce it. Naomi moved through the nearly empty space with the same steady pace she had carried all evening, collecting what remained, restoring order to a place that had briefly lost its balance. The chandeliers above still cast their warm glow, but now the light felt different, less like a spotlight, more like something gentle, something that simply existed without judgment. She paused near one of the long tables, setting down the last of the glasses, her fingers brushing lightly against the smooth surface as if grounding herself in something real after a night that had felt almost unreal in its shift. Around her, a few staff members worked quietly, their conversations low, their movements efficient. But every now and then, a glance would pass in her direction, not curious, not questioning, but aware, as if they too had witnessed something that changed more than just a single moment. The manager approached her slowly, his steps measured, his usual authority replaced by something more reflective, more deliberate. "Naomi," he said, her name coming more naturally this time, without the distance it once carried. "You did well tonight." She turned to face him, her posture relaxed but upright, her expression calm. "I did my job," she replied, the same words she had spoken before, but now they carried a different meaning, not a dismissal, not a deflection, but a quiet affirmation of something she no longer needed to explain. He nodded, though it was clear he understood more than the words themselves. "Still," he added, "not everyone would have handled that the way you did." Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod in return. Accepting the acknowledgement without letting it define her, there was nothing more to say, and neither of them tried to force it. He stepped away, returning to his responsibilities, but the shift in his tone, in the way he had spoken her name, remained. Across the room, the staff began dimming the lights, one section at a time, until the grand space softened into shadows and reflections, the kind that blurred edges and quieted everything that had once demanded attention. Naomi gathered her things, her movements unhurried, as if she was no longer racing against something unseen, no longer trying to move through the world without leaving a trace. Near the exit, she paused again, not because she needed to, but because something in the space asked for it, something that held the memory of what had happened there. She looked around once more, not at the people, not at the details, but at the room itself, the place that had witnessed her almost become smaller than she was, and then refused to remain that way. The door opened softly as she stepped outside, the cool air wrapping around her again, the city stretching out in front of her with its quiet lights and distant movement, unchanged by what had happened within those walls. She took a breath, slow and steady, feeling it settle deep, not as relief, but as clarity. Behind her, the doors closed, the sounds of the hall fading into silence. But she did not look back. She did not need to. Whatever had been left there no longer belonged to her. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her steps beginning to carry her forward along the sidewalk, each one steady, certain, not hurried, not hesitant. The night moved around her, cars passing, distant voices blending into the background, the ordinary rhythm of a world that did not pause for anyone. And yet she walked through it differently now. Not because the world had changed, but because something within her had settled into place. She thought of the moment when she had almost spoken words that were not hers, words that would have taken something from her that she could not easily reclaim. And she realized how close she had come to letting that happen without question, without resistance. But she had not. Not because she fought, not because she argued, but because she remained, long enough for the truth to stand beside her. And in that realization, something became clear, something simple, something quiet, something that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Respect was never something that could be forced, never something that could be demanded or performed. It revealed itself, slowly, unmistakably, in the moments when truth was allowed to exist without being pushed aside. Naomi continued walking, her silhouette moving through the soft glow of streetlights, no longer blending into the background, no longer trying to, and somewhere behind her, in a room now empty and still, the echo of that moment remained, not loud, not dramatic, but lasting. And that night, without a single raised voice, the world remembered what dignity looks like.